Software Engineering Radio episode 93, Lessons Learned from Architecture Reviews with Rebecca Wirfs-Brock.
This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers, on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio brings you relevant and detailed discussions and interviews on software engineering topics every 10 days. Thanks to our audience and the partners listed on our website for supporting the podcast.
Welcome listeners to another episode of Software Engineering Radio. This time we are at the JAU conference in Denmark once again, and we're talking to Rebecca Wirfs-Brock today about lessons learned from architecture reviews. So Rebecca, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Very nice. And why don't you introduce yourself so our listeners know who you are?
Well, I'm best known for having invented responsibility-driven design, which is a way of thinking about organizing systems and dividing responsibilities amongst objects. But in my recent travels, I've spent a lot of time looking at architectures and sorting those out, which is the purpose of what we're going to talk today.
Yeah. So recent travels hints at that you're probably a traveling consultant.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So the topic today will be architecture reviews. We already had a more conceptual discussion last year at JAU with Dragos Manolescu. So this year is going to be probably a much more practical view on it. Lessons learned sounds to be practical. So why don't you give us a quick overview of what it's all about, and then we'll talk about details.
Well, from my perspective, I've been involved in two ways. As one who has, obviously as a consultant, gone in and tried to review an architecture with teams. I get asked to do that. And so I've learned things about how people tell me things and how to really find out what's really going on. Mm-hmm. And then the other aspect is, as a developer, lead designer, presenting material for reviews. So I get both sides of the coin.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing that we have in our script, or on your slides or whatever, is a statement that says, beware of the technical stack. What does that suggest? I have an idea. But
you have an idea. Well, in some sense, I'm thinking of a specific review where I went in, and the only thing that was there that the chief technical architect would talk about was the technical stack and the beauty of it. And the picture on the slide is of Zen stones nicely stacked up and arranged and beautiful. And there was no substance behind the technical stack. So the technical stack does not make the architecture. And I find many times the technical nuances are what intrigues smart architects, and they worry about the wrong things.
So, and just to get it clear, technical stack, you mean I use WebLogic X, Y, Z, and then I have a web service communication to the other guy.
And we're using BPEL, and here's our messaging strategy. And, the real problem was to unify two domain models, and we didn't even think about that, or something like that.
Yeah, okay.
And so it's easy to get... in our field, I think any smart architect likes to consider the latest technology.
Yes.
And the whole stack is beautiful, but the solving of the real problem might be uglier.
Yeah, actually, I've also, that's one of the things I always talk about, that you should talk also about the conceptual aspects of an architecture. Is it asynchronous, synchronous, is stateless, stateful, these kinds of things, and not just on real technical tool details.
And it's easy to latch onto technical tool details because there's all kinds of things we can dig into as opposed to the other qualities as well. Performance, scalability, usability, all those things.
Yeah. The other thing is visualize the benefits. So probably first make people happy of what you have, and then start criticizing. Or what does that mean?
Well, in actual fact, I think if you're trying to present your architecture to someone, that we can present them very technical, detailed descriptions and draw nice pictures. But if they don't know what it's going to do for them and why it's going to be a good architecture, then we haven't spoken to their heart. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking in particular, again, putting on a different hat, as when I worked on a telco integration framework, and we worked on great models and presented a prototype, But the key thing that sold it to the management was the visualizing the benefits of the fact is we had this don't call us, we'll call you architecture with an adapter.
Yeah.
And so you'd have common adapters to common systems that we were trying to integrate. And that would really reduce the costs of integration of new systems as we were acquiring them. And with all our beautiful architecture, if they didn't understand and could visualize why what we were pushing was important, then, and when they did, they got very excited.
Yep.
So we needed to find a way to communicate the essence that was really going to be, the important thing.
Yep. And well, if you do a review, how do you find the right people to whom you show what you have, and also how do you find the people who are actually good candidates to tell about the architecture? What about how do you find out which people to get involved?
Well, it's again from both perspectives. If you find that you need to have a technical review, obviously you need technical people involved, and it's good to have a different perspective than just people like you. So if I'm integrating a system, it would be nice to have other people that I'm integrating with who are experts in that area or the technology. And actually, I think we're pretty good at finding technical reviewers. But what we don't find is that sometimes the product owners and the people who really are going to demand those things of our systems, if we just had them there, then they could tell us the right stories that we needed to support. We like to create things, and if we over-engineer things because we think they want it, then we can get in trouble.
So maybe another term for this would be stakeholder integration. Get all the stakeholders and make sure everybody has a say in the thing. And
stakeholders aren't just I'd say product sponsors or someone who are buying it, but they're people who may be in the marketing that are specifying features if we're developing products as well.
Yep. So in some sense, if you do an architecture review, you're kind of the inquisitor, right? So you go there and you have to make sure you're actually getting to the point and finding the issues if there are any. So asking the right question is probably a big deal.
Yes, and asking the right questions doesn't necessarily say, we're not looking for, is the architecture good, yes or no?
Okay.
I don't think those binary questions are really what we're doing.
Sure.
We're probing for, does it meet the real characteristics that we must have?
Assuming they're specified somewhere.
If they aren't, then I would say there's a little bit of problem or a little bit of investigation about what the real qualities that we're trying to produce. And so that leads you into, as a reviewer, if someone doesn't ask you or doesn't present everything, you need to be prepared to ask those questions. You need to propose and probe and uncover the things that may not be said. Wouldn't it be nice if I had all this documentation and I just dived into a review and it was easy, but it's never that way.
So let's get specific. Are there some stereotypes or idioms that you can use to think about what kind of questions to ask?
Well, I think that as a question asker, I always feel like there's an old TV show about this detective called Columbo. It's a U.S. TV show. And he was this unassuming gentleman. He wore rumpled clothing. Yeah. And he was always basically, well, I don't know, but maybe you know. Can you tell me? So in actual fact, I am not making judgments, but I might evaluate. Well, how good do you think this is going to be, right? It's one kind of thing. Is that really so? So reaffirming when someone makes a claim that maybe is outrageous, but in another way, coming back and saying, well, is that really the case? I heard you say this, but do you mean that? I don't know this, but maybe is that really so? So you could ask, accuracy questions, or are they complete? Is that all? Gee, that doesn't sound like there's enough there. So there's all these kinds of ways of asking questions in a way. I think it's not just asking probing questions, but asking them in a way that gets people to open up. and not necessarily if I'm conducting a review being so judgmental, but I'm just trying to get them to open up.
Yeah. Another technique that I like to use is that I reformulate what they just said in my words, maybe draw a little diagram and try to understand what they did, say the same thing in my world, and then just see whether that kind of is compatible to make sure I understood it correctly.
Absolutely. And in some sense, when I'm doing this, I have to go in there without, although I'm a threat as a consultant.
Exactly.
I'm an external source of agitation. Why did I get brought in anyway?
You evaluate their work.
Yeah, exactly. And so in some sense, I need to also validate that whatever they're telling me they're telling me the truth, and that I just want to understand and help me, clarify my understanding of what you're doing. I think that's a lot of what I do.
Yeah. So you basically try to make them think. You ask questions where you hope that it makes them think of what they just said and what they maybe should have thought about when they built the system, and hopefully did.
And sometimes, there's a subtle art to that, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And so, why did you do that way? What's the purpose of something? Oh, I can understand. Well, did you consider, so again, in a gentle way, I guess, rather than a harsh way and I can have them reveal limitations that way that they may not have been at first willing to talk about or even thought about. I mean, were they really aware of that? Well, maybe not. But so I bring my context and background into it as well.
Yes. Yeah. So how important is it that you as a reviewer actually understand the kind of system they built, be it the domain or maybe some of the architectural technical issues? Do you think everybody can review every good reviewer can review any kind of architecture, or do you need a connection to the kind of stuff they're doing in addition to it being software?
Well, that's a good question, because in some sense, I've been asked to review a variety of different things of which I've had no knowledge of. Yeah. But from my general ancient background of over 20 years of software development and systems, I can usually draw some connections. For example, an enterprise Java application certainly has some common nuts and bolts that I'm familiar with. But I think it's fair to say where you're not competent to review, so you don't just want to dive in and, concurrent real-time embedded systems is not my forte, if you will. Although I have done technical reviews for that, but I do have some background in that too. So I don't think you want to overextend your knowledge. But if you don't understand the technology, then it's somewhat difficult.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's my experience too. Although sometimes I think new technologies are just the old stuff with a new name, and you can. I mean, SOA is a good example. I mean, if you've done distributed systems, well, it's not that big a deal.
It's not that different. And if you're talking about message orchestration, well, there's other things that we did before. So, but there is new nuances and accumulated technology things. But not everything about an architecture is technical.
Exactly. That's what we talked about before. The next thing that's on our list is probably to judge how big you organize the review. Like if you're a 2-person project, you shouldn't come with a 5-person review team. So how do you size the review to the architecture?
Well, it's really a matter of how much they want to know about the architecture. And if it's a small change, if you will, let's say an incremental release, or I'm just re-implementing the same things on a new hardware platform. So it's not always just the team size, but it's the size of the architectural change.
Size of the problem.
Yes, that they're trying to solve. And so I'm thinking back to people who want to really get it right, may start up and think they need this big formal review cycle, but they have to really consider, is this a major architectural significance? Is this a new thing, or is it just some incremental? So that's one consideration. A review team of 1 or 2 people can actually do quite a lot. I wouldn't think that the size of a project is so important as the size of the architectural change and impact.
Mhm.
You know, how much to scope and what you
Yep.
need to do. Particularly if you're building something that is designed to have a 10-year life cycle or 15-year life cycle, you know, being like the Egyptian pyramids lasting a long time requires more care and review than otherwise. So.
Yeah. So saying if you're building a platform for a product line, it's a different thing than if you just hack your web application.
Well,
Well,
yes.
Yeah. Another metric that I like to use is also simply how much money would you like to spend? I mean, I've had cases where they said, we like to have this architecture review done, and we 3 days. I think 3 days should. Well, we don't have more money, so that also answers the question.
Well, yes, and that's true. They'll get what they find in that time frame. And so in that case, you really have to focus on what are the key values that you want me to explore.
Yeah.
Because I could wallow in the review all over the place, look all over the system.
So how detailed do you expect your, how do you say this, reviewee, or the thing you review, or your customer in that sense, how specifically do you want them to ask you specific questions that you try to find out? Do you just go in there and say, well, let's review the architecture, or how specific are the goals of the architecture itself specified typically?
It actually depends on how experienced they are at doing reviews. I mean, some people would like to follow a process like something like the ATEM, the SEI. Well, let's look at the quality scenarios and growth scenarios, and Rebecca, do come in and help us examine those things. And those are rare, actually, in my experience. And most people say, well, we're doing something that's this size, and we know we have some problems or concerns here. So you tell me what your concerns are. As a consultant,
Sure.
I can come in and then probe around. And then I may decide that I need another colleague or two to help. And I can counter-propose. So much money, well, this is what you'll get.
Yeah, sure.
But maybe we need to look deeper.
Yeah. So leveling the playing field, I guess, is crucial. I mean, if you have this architect who feels intimidated by the review team who comes in and like, as I said, one architect, 5 reviewers, then there's something wrong. So there's also, I guess, this psychological issue.
Well, it's really the case, and that even within a company, let's say not having an outside consultant come in, but if I have to go in front of a number of people and present my architectural ideas, and it's a big threat, and maybe there's politics involved and all that kind of stuff. And so, in actual fact, if companies do set aside and get some consistency amongst it, it can make it so the expectations aren't that you're going to go in front of the the Inquisition, if you will, but that it's a set of peers that are helping architects express and do it in a, I'm going to say, non-political way, but a supportive review. Then that can kind of make it less intimidating and more effective for companies too.
I think that's maybe also one of the reasons why external reviewers are brought in, because they are not involved in politics.
That's a good point, but someone politically brought us in. Someone brought us in for a reason.
Well, okay.
Someone has some worry, right? Some concern.
Right.
So, but we don't have a vested interest in a particular outcome unless we're, let's say, a technologist who works for a product that they're having employed as part of their architecture.
In which case, you're not a good reviewer, I would guess. But
well, that's actually not always the case. When we were at interviewing and getting reviewers for this telco product that I worked on, we purposefully asked the technologist, one of the external reviewers, to be the server product, because we were early implementation of this Java server technology. And so, but we didn't expect them to make all the comments about other things. Right.
They were specifically there to help you with their system.
Yes.
Okay, sure. Yeah. What are rainy day scenarios?
What happens when things go wrong? When one of the things that sometimes people ask you in a review is, let's make sure we understand the limits of our system and what it can really do. We're investing a lot. So can you please help us understand and articulate the limits and the constraints, and have our technology addressed it? But I find that sometimes they have a tough time saying what will really happen. How much do they really want to invest in recovery or performance, scalability when life is bad, when the architecture is really, strained and pushed to its limits.
Yeah, which typically means that several things go wrong at the same time. So you have several risks that kind of stack onto each other to really get to the problem, like any accident, right?
Absolutely. And so it's really kind of interesting when you do have those situations, and I'm thinking of, again, another telco system that I worked on, is that you had to, what was really important in that case was articulating the limits, although it would roll over, fail over to another computing system. We had to say, well, two major faults at the same time is where we stopped, you know, because there's only so much investment. Yes. But until they articulated that, the architects they wanted to make it more reliable, and they needed to know the boundaries. And so expressing the limits to the rainy day or bad things go wrong can really help people do that. But we have trouble stopping and knowing what's enough. Either it's too hard, so we don't try to do anything in our architecture to recover, or we want to do so much that we don't know when to stop, right?
Yeah, and it goes back to this requirements thing. I have not worked much in the telco area or something, but I think it's very hard to make a customer say, well, how many nines do you need after the dot? What are you willing, which risks are you willing to take with regards, for example, to uptime? So getting precise requirements in order to know where to stop is probably not that trivial, also for a reviewer.
Well, I would say for hardware-related systems, it is easier to get those numbers. But then from a software standpoint, the software that's influencing really how many nines you get, then it becomes a matter of, well, how much effort can we expend? Because to get to that next 9 is in order of magnitude. But also, people don't like to talk about failure and recovery, just in general. We think about requirements in terms of what something should do, not how should it recover. Yeah. And, but yes, it must, but they don't like to talk a lot about that. Yep. In actual fact, when you're talking about risk compound, one of the other problems that people have is if they don't know exactly the probability of a failure or a probability of something happening, and you're trying to architect or present options based on a spectrum of options that we must do, they tend to favor things that are known probabilities and latch onto those and discuss those over things that it's not so clear. And that's natural human nature. If something appears to be a better situation, then they're going to, if we're presenting a range of architectural alternatives, something that appears more certain, even though it has less benefit, is easy to select or want to have than something that's going to have big benefit, but it's not so certain that we'll get that benefit.
And why is that a problem, or why is that bad?
Well, if I'm an architect and I'm really proposing something, if I can offer facts, concrete facts, again, flipping around to this point of view, concrete facts that absolutely demonstrate that this will have, 35.8% better, then it's far better if something, well, I think it will, but I'm not certain. And sometimes with new technology, it's very difficult for us to give those numbers. And so we give sometimes probabilities, and people don't react well if they're trying to choose amongst options for things I think are going to be good. Trust me, and sometimes they should question, but sometimes if something seems so certain, they'll pick some choice that involves, let's say, technology or even software development risk that isn't going to have a big enough benefit, because it's the easy, certain thing to do. And sometimes we have to push for more risky things. But if there's more uncertainty around it, then people don't like that. They're going to back away. It's just human nature. So as an architect, if I'm trying to sell an idea...
That's the point,
Yeah, the more facts I have, the better better I am able to compel people.
And facts are either experience reports or maybe metrics, measurable.
Yeah, prototypes, measurable types of things. But if I'm having to conjecture a bit, that's when I start to be a little bit, doubted. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of risks that we don't know, and a lot of precisely what, why are we doing something? I mean, we know it will be better, but we can't quantify things as clearly as we might like to make our argument. And then there's the case, if you're, talking about people listening to your ideas as an architect, if they perceive that something is not certain, and I've had managers myself react this way, and you need to test this. Either they totally ignore any risk, or they totally are in fear of that risk happening. So they either switch from, either they totally ignore the probability and leap ahead if they want, or they become paralyzed by it. And that's actually a dangerous thing too when you're, the risks of an architecture.
I recently heard a podcast where some scientists said that humans are really bad in working with probability in general. So that's one of the reasons that they kind of see this number, it's closer to 0 than 100, or the other way around, and then they kind of flip to this, it's going to be bad.
Yes, thing. Right. Well, and it depends upon whether they're an eternal pessimist or an optimist.
Yes, yeah.
And depending upon the company, if you will, and the circumstance, it maybe is beneficial to be a little bit risk adverse. Mm-hmm. If you look at certain companies, they make their business off of being risk adverse. Yep. And others, on the other hand, do have to take those risks.
Okay. Information bias.
Well, so when I'm presenting information that supports an idea, we've been talking about the reason why people sometimes flip over binaries, they become fearful. But what the other problem can be that even if I'm proposing an architectural idea and giving some credible evidence, that it's never enough. We ask for more data. Oh, that was a nice prototype, but can you show what's going to happen here? And they keep asking and asking because they're not going to commit to our architecture, right? And so in that case, it's a very difficult challenge as an architect to get them over that hurdle and take your new idea. So in some sense, you have to try very hard to present facts in new ways and convince people, maybe by even saying, well, our competitors are doing this.
Yeah. So we should do something else.
Yeah.
Okay. When you're building systems these days, there's typically, at least in the enterprise world, there's typically always legacy stuff involved. So there's always the existing systems with which you have to merge or integrate or which you have to evolve. So I guess there are some specific risks and also then as a consequence, some specific points you should address as a reviewer.
Well, absolutely. And I think actually Eric Evans' strategic design, which he's going to be talking about at this conference, is one way to address that. In that if we're merging existing systems, perhaps it's not just the technology that we should be concerned about, but are there domain models and data that needs to be merged? And the platform isn't just one isolated silo that we just bang into another one.
Yeah.
And in some sense, merging existing technologies isn't just the only problem. There's the operational risks of how do I get the systems converted and working together. Yeah. And to me, those things can be showstoppers on many reviews. And actually, if I'm just focusing on the new technology, then all these other merging of customer needs, of platforms, of domain models, of data can be a huge problem that people don't recognize the consequence.
Yeah, and another thing when you integrate several systems is that you often throw away one of them, more or less, and people are often reluctant if they have invested in a lot of work into it. It's their baby.
It's their baby, and in some sense, we spent a lot for that baby, and we bought that baby from another company. Let's say we merged a company even, and then we must do something with it, right? Whereas in actual fact, it probably would have been better, again, to take the functionality and re-implement it rather than try to bolt systems together. Yep. But once I've invested, right? In that technology or that other system, I want to try to use it.
Yes.
It's like, in some sense, I think that executives think that it's less cost to integrate, but they don't understand the deep issues.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing that comes to mind is that many people actually likes, well, the problem is if you promise the big benefit, but it's far away, people won't maybe let you actually do it. So you have to do small steps and show small benefits.
And so in that case, it isn't the case that we want to just, throw that away and re-implement it, but we'd like to merge the system gradually over time or do things like that. And that takes an understanding of a longer-term set of steps. But if we don't break it down into smaller steps of how to get there, and if we as architects just say, well, here's the end state, and it's so far away, it's so much easier for them to just take the low-hanging fruit of the easy thing and never get to where we need to be integrated, really integrated. Yeah. And so as an architecture review consultant, I guess my job sometimes has been to point out what everyone knows are the problems, but they just don't like to talk about so much.
Yeah.
And it's not just technology, it's how do I handle technology and how do I merge designs and how do I really benefit the most out of things.
Yep. Okay, let's look a little bit about how you describe decisions, because I mean, as the review, the one whose architecture is going to be reviewed, you will have to explain why you did things the way you do, because that's one of the main points of architecture reviews, I guess. So, what can you say about how do you actually explain ideas and decisions to a reviewer? What do you want to hear?
Well, I think it depends on your audience. Are you having someone who's going to give you a constructive set of commentary back and that's what you'd like? Mm-hmm. Or are you trying to sell something to someone and they say, yes, I'll buy it? And those are two different kinds of reviewers. And if I'm wanting to have a constructive, thoughtful review, I think there's one pattern. And if I'm trying to sell it, I might want to put a little slant on it a bit differently. And so I, as a reviewer, I want to make clear that usually I'm not, as an external reviewer, I'm not buying or selling. I'm just getting a judgment. And I'm reflecting back things that you may reveal to me. So I'm going to ask you questions about what requirements drove you to it, and what things aren't you going to consider? Because we could find fault with as we've talked about earlier, with almost anything. So what were the limits that you designed to or proposed in certain aspects of your architecture? And what give me a set of your benefits and disadvantages? Because let's consider them. I may, from my experience that isn't the same as yours, be able to give you some ideas where I've seen elsewhere. So I can, give you some insights. And if you're honest about it, again, for a constructive reviewer, if there were things that you were not certain about and you wanted me to reflect upon, well, then tell me. And so that's one pattern for a constructive, thoughtful person who isn't going to say, yes, no, I'm going to slam you, but they're going to give you valuable feedback to improve the architecture. So on the other hand, if you have someone who is going to be a little bit more judgmental, you may start out with the things that limited our considerations. And then here's what we did. And we ruled out these things because of those facts. Yeah. And here's what we're recommending. Sell. Yeah. And that's a different approach. Yeah. That's a little different approach.
Yeah. Something that I like to use, not in order to sell an architecture, but just in order to document the single decisions, is actually the pattern form. A pattern is also like a single piece of information that is well described with problem, solution, context, and so on. And I think that's also a good pattern to describe any kind of decision and information. So that's also maybe an alternative that could be used.
So that's actually interesting. On our telco integration framework, where I got external reviewers for, we actually did document our design decisions that way.
Yeah.
And we had like 10 maybe key decisions that drove us.
Yes.
And we did use that.
Yeah.
And I wasn't thinking so much of patterns at the time, but it just seemed like a good way to explain it. But you're right, it does match the patterns.
In some sense, the pattern form is just a good way to explain something.
Yes. Yeah. Well, now the other thing, though, that was slightly different other than the pattern form was, again, we were looking for feedback. So not just saying what the forces were, but also the issues that we wanted you to address.
Yes.
So we wanted to leave it open for someone to comment on.
Mm-hmm. So how do you work with biases that people have? I mean, be they political, or there's this web service guy who wants to do everything with web services, or there's Gregor Hope who wants to do everything with messaging. So whatever you do, they're kind of biased towards certain solutions. How do you handle those?
Or aspects rule the world, they're really cool.
Yeah.
And not everyone shares the same biases, and if you latch on to an idea, you think it's really great. I think it's really hard to overcome biases or predispositions, right? If I've done something a certain way, then I tend to follow that cow path. We pave the cow path, as you say.
Yeah.
And in some sense, the first thing to realize is that you have biases too. I mean, I do.
Sure, I have, clearly.
Yes. Small talk is one of my favorite biases.
Model-driven development.
Yeah, that's right. So, in matter of fact, recognizing that people will naturally, it's not good or bad, but it's just my easy, non-thinking reaction to something. And then to recognize that I have to point them out if I'm going to, or subtly manipulate them that they, and that's not selling, it's subtly manipulating it so the information that they should be seeing is more evident to them to overcome their biases for them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the next big issue is, of course, how do you make sure if you give an advice that people actually care and follow it? So you have to be convincing also as a reviewer, because you have to make them do what you think is good. Well, you should at least.
Well, you can't make anyone do anything as an external reviewer, but you'd like to make it clear that there are things that they should do. And it's there, if they don't do it, here's what you think about it, right? Mm-hmm. And so in actual fact, I've learned that in order to, again, not be threatening, but be realistic, to break down what I do into recommendations versus suggestions and observations. So an observation, if you stack up a number of observations, well, maybe they could draw some conclusions from that. Yeah. But not everything do I want to do that. So I limit the time that I to the really big recommendations. I can have a number of suggestions, but big recommendations should come out, and the other observations they can draw their conclusions from.
So what you're saying is, for the really important things that you really think are mission critical, you give specific recommendations. And as concretely as I can, supported by evidence. Because again, there are those people that say fact finding, and so if I can even use the words that I heard in a review, or samples of code if they're showing things, so I can support it with evidence. But oftentimes the people that are reading or listening into your recommendations, and I usually write written recommendations, want to know what's the heavy hitter items, the most important, and how do I support it with evidence, and then all these other things, those are nice. Yeah, it's actually interesting now, after you actually did the review as a reviewer, now you become kind of the architect, because now you have to communicate or sell your, let's say, changes or your changed architecture based on your review, your recommendations. So whenever you do an architecture review, you also have to play the role of the architect.
That's an interesting point. And in some sense, I would say that I'm not the architect, but I'm also not the casual observer anymore. And so I am someone who's saying, given my wisdom and my insight, here's how I might adjust your architecture. So it's a careful line. I've seen some architecture reviewers go way over to just damning and telling it's bad and whatever. Whereas if you're trying to have an impact, you just need to focus on, here's the key things I think must change and why.
Yep.
In some sense, I think that if you adopt a triage mentality when you're trying to make recommendations, when someone walks in a disaster and there's a number of people that are injured, or there are spots in the architecture that aren't quite so, a triage basically says there are things we can do something about. So they tie a green, a orange or yellow ribbon around it if it's serious enough.
Yep.
If it's dead and it's hopeless, they tie a black ribbon around it.
Yes.
And if it's green, like it's maybe a little problem but nothing, they're walking wounded that don't need immediate attention.
Sure. Yeah.
So it's trying to make sure that the most important things get emphasized.
Yep.
And the other things can, not everything has to be addressed.
So how do you persuade people to actually do then these things?
Well, as I said, I have a written presentation usually that I do, but I also like to review my presentation with the key stakeholders before I deliver it as well. So I'm saying, here's the things I'm going to say, and then who should I really target this report to so that they listen? So, for example, I may bring in, a VP of engineering may bring me in, okay, but he really wants the CTO to hear the message. Yeah. And so in some sense, I'm not trying to blindside the person who brought me in to do the review. I'm trying to support and discuss with him. And so in some sense, then I package it, and this sounds like marketing, doesn't it? But that the person who's the primary target of the change or the recommendations hears it. Mm-hmm. And they may not hear exactly what they wanted to hear. Oh, everything was rosy. But so I have to make sure that they agree with my assessment, and then present it in a way that perhaps raise some of those issues that they weren't comfortable with hearing before. They might have fixed on something and said, oh, yes, we're okay, we're great in this area, right? And then you have to get them unstuck on that point, perhaps. Yep. And so it takes some convincing. Now, unless I live with a company after I do a review, I don't always get to choose, to make sure that they hear all of what I say. But I do my best. I do my best. Yeah. Sometimes they don't listen to what you say, so they're going to try to seek out information that supports their pre-held view, and that's a very difficult challenge as an architect.
So what do you do then?
Well, they paid for me to come in and talk to them, right? They paid for me to spend a week or maybe even 2 weeks going and working with technical staff. Yeah. And if I present them enough evidence and they say, well, you were pretty harsh on us, and then they don't take my call to action, there's not much I can do except for saying, I did my honest assessment. Mm-hmm. So I can't fix the world, but I can point out the most critical things to consider.
So so you probably even shouldn't feel really responsible of having these things implemented, except if you're also going to be brought in to actually implement things. But otherwise, you basically your mission is to point out what the problems are and give recommendations, and that's it.
And that's it, in a way that they will hear. And so you do have to, again, listen to who is this report or this review for. And oftentimes it's, for me, I'm presenting a number of issues to the technical staff and architects. They tend to have no problem listening to me. It's usually the executives higher up where they may have to make some tough decisions that it's more difficult.
So how much of actually, when you present the results of your review, or written or as an actual presentation,
I probably do both. Yeah.
So how much of that is psychology and marketing as opposed to hard facts?
Well, I think it's a blend, and the hard facts have to be there. My experience
as a basis, but it's not enough.
But it's not enough. Yeah. It's not enough. And in some sense, if all I did was present hard facts, they probably wouldn't pay me so much, because I'd just be a technical. And so putting a spin on it in a way that has reflected that I understand both their mission, their marketplace, and don't just focus on one thing, but try to fit into their context, my comments, has a bigger impact.
Mm-hmm.
So in some sense, I have to develop a relationship with a variety of stakeholders in order to have the impact that I'd like in a review.
And since sometimes those stakeholders are on different sides of the table, that can be quite a challenge.
That can be quite a challenge. I don't know whether it's a good thing or not, but when at the end of a review, when both the architects, product marketing, and engineering are happy with me, I think I've done my job.
Yes.
They may not be happy with the magnitude of a recommendation, but at least they felt like I heard their concerns, and I think that's fair. And I was fair, but not dismissive of little problems.
Yep.
So they're appreciative in that way. Now, do they act? That's another question.
Okay, so this brings us to the end of our discussion. Is there anything else you want to say that we forgot, or any words of wisdom towards the end?
Well, I actually think that as a company or a product development group or a IT group, that sometimes you do need that external perspective. And so, external reviewers are good. I'm not saying this just for having a, need for more consulting. But on the other hand, if you're doing that you ought to consider that what's the next step? You need to. I'm very frustrated, by people who take reviews and say, "Well, that was nice. Now let's go find another reviewer who might tell us what we want to hear." Yes. I've heard this at other people who do architecture reviews, and in some sense, if you're investing in this, then you should invest in some solutions too.
Exactly, that was the prefix or the prelude, the foreword that I put onto the last review I did, because I was skeptical about whether my customer would actually do what I said, and actually realized that, you pay me, you better at least consider it seriously what I say. And so try to.
and if they're not, then I suppose it's their problem. Yeah. But in actual fact, I don't want to be part of their problem. I really don't. I don't come in there with my agenda.
Yeah. So let me ask one last thing that just came to my mind. There is this thing about code reviews. So teams do internal code reviews to increase the quality of the code, but also to make the reviewers aware of what's happening. Do you think it's a good idea if you have a large organization to have the teams do architecture reviews between or among themselves? So every architecture team is also a reviewer of other architectures, just to see both sides of the coin.
I actually think that if you build an architecture practice, that's one of the fundamental things to do. And so large companies that I know that are successful actually do this. And in some sense, then you need to have this culture that says, when we make commentary, we're not trying to compete or those kind of things. But how do I develop a supportive culture? And I think it really helps because there isn't just one best architecture. Sure. And if we're doing product lines or we're doing enterprise applications, certain things may demand different choices, and people make choices that change over time. So developing that community of practice in larger organizations is really important. Then they don't need us so much as consultants, if they develop their own review culture. And that would be just fine by me. Yeah. But they need to know how to communicate again, and that's
not a skill you'd find too often in techies.
Too often, yes. And they also need to know, in some sense, how to give a realistic presentation of both benefits and risks in a way that isn't going to turn people off or snow them with too much dazzling technical brilliance. Yeah.
Okay, Rebecca, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, very good.
Here is a message from our sponsor.
Hallo,
hier sind Bernd Österreich
und Christian Weiß von der Firma Ose aus Hamburg.
Wir suchen zur Festanstellung J2E-Entwickler mit exzellenten Architektur- und Java-Erfahrungen.
Als Coach und Trainer bringst du unseren Kunden bei, systematisch bessere Software zu entwickeln.
Was erlebst du als besonders an Ose? Tja, die OSE ist eine bisschen eigene Firma so. Also wir sagen ja auch manchmal, man muss eigentlich ein Jahr bei der OSE sein, um wirklich zu verstehen, wie sie funktioniert. Weil die OSE ein ganz entscheidendes Charakteristikum ist die Selbstorganisation. Es gibt nicht so klare hierarchische Strukturen und man bekommt gesagt, ja, du machst jetzt aber das und das. Sondern sehr viel passiert dadurch, dass man sich selber Sachen sucht, selber Sachen aussucht, die einen interessieren. Da unterscheidet sich die OSE, dass man viel mehr Freiheiten, viel mehr Gestaltungsmöglichkeiten als Einzelne auch hat.
Es geht eher so zu wie im Lehrerzimmer von einer größeren Schule, würde ich sagen. Also Abwechslung ist das Besondere bei OSE, würde ich sagen. Ja.
Was ich ganz besonders finde, ist, dass hier das Thema Work-Life-Balance großgeschrieben wird. Also es geht wirklich so, es ist nicht nur eine hohle Phrase, dass Reisezeit gleich Arbeitszeit ist. Also es geht wirklich auch darum, nach der Arbeitszeit auch frei zu haben.
So eine völlig andere interne Kultur und Denkweise, weil wir von Austausch und Miteinander halt Werte haben, die ich inzwischen sehr hoch schätze, die aber nicht üblich sind in der Branche.
Mit Themen wie Verantwortung und Eigenverantwortung, Kommunikation, auch sehr besondere Umgangsformen pflegen und das gefällt mir sehr gut.
Ich habe halt auch sehr viel Gestaltungsmöglichkeit. Ich kann halt auch selber relativ stark steuern, wo ich mich weiterentwickeln will.
Das Spektrum ist recht groß dafür, dass die Firma so klein ist.
Wir freuen uns auf deine Bewerbung.
Schau mal rein unter www.ose.de
Mit Doppel-O.
oder schaue im Sing unter Christian Weiß.
Mit Doppel-S.
Thanks for listening to Software Engineering Radio. If you want more information about the podcast and all the other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. If you want to support us, you can donate to the SE Radio team via the website, or you can advertise for SE Radio, for example, by clicking on the Dig, Reddit, Delicious and Slashdot buttons. To contact the team, please send email to team@seradio.net, or if it's specific to an episode, please use the comments facility on the website so other people can read and react to your comments. This episode of Software Engineering Radio, as well as all other episodes, are licensed under a Creative Commons license. Please see the website for details. Thanks to Charlie Crow and the PodSafe Music Network for the music used in this show. The song is called Vegas Hard Rock Shuffle.